This lecture will discuss Unit 2 strategies for storytelling through time, and we'll be looking at the legend of King Arthur, and we'll be talking about how to approach the tracing of the legend of King Arthur through a rhetorical analysis. So, just to give us a little background and kind of get us started, talk about where we've been and where we're going with this. So, we've been learning about the legend of King Arthur, and we began by watching Disney's The Sword and the Stone. And the reason we watched this was to give you some background information on King Arthur if you weren't very familiar with the story. And since the audience for that is children, which we'll talk about later, it's a good way to introduce it because it's going to be simplified. And then we looked at some more difficult sources. We looked at Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, which is one of the first English translations of the Arthurian legend, and that comes to us during the Middle Ages, so a very old text. And some of you said that you had difficulty reading and understanding the text, and I'll have some tips for you on that later in another video. And then we watched the 1981 film Excalibur, which uses Mallory's Morte d'Arthur as the primary source to create it. So Excalibur is a retelling of the entirety of Mallory's text. We just read small portions of Mallory's text, but the film is actually the entirety of his text. And along the way, we've been reading in the Bedford Book of Genres about heroes and villains and about rhetorical analysis. We've been looking at the Little DK handbook to learn more about rhetorical analysis. I've created lectures, we participated in discussions, and again, we watched Disney's The Sword and the Stone. And so in this lecture, I'm going to use Disney's The Sword and the Stone as my example when I show you how to construct a thesis, how to question a text and understand and create analysis. Since we've all watched The Sword and the Stone, I'm going to use that as an example. However, in your major assignment 2, you're going to use Mallory and Excalibur to create your rhetorical analysis. You're not going to use The Sword and the Stone. I'm going to use that to teach you how to do an analysis, but you're going to use the other two texts. And when I say text, a film is a text, and we'll talk about why later. So in this lecture, I'll be using The Sword and the Stone as the example, but in your paper, you'll be writing about Morte d'Arthur and Excalibur. Okay? So just to kind of stop for a moment and think about what I'm asking you to do when I'm asking you to create an analysis. And in order to understand what I'm asking you to do when I'm asking you to create an analysis, you kind of have to know what an analysis is. So simply put, an analysis is just breaking something into its pieces to learn how the pieces fit together to create a larger whole. Okay? In a college level analysis, we need to move from analyzing to understand to analyzing to ask questions in our composition process. But in order to get to the analyzing to ask questions part, we got to kind of create the analyzing to understand part. I've been asking you to do this in our class in this unit by asking you to consider audience and purpose and the rhetorical appeals. And that will help us quickly move to the analyzing to ask questions phase. So we'll start in the lecture with some strategies for learning to understand, analyzing to understand, and then we'll move to questioning so that when you create your written analysis, you will have participated in both parts of the process. So again, before we can analyze to ask questions, we have to analyze to understand. And in the Little DK handbook, Ann Wysocki and David Lynch say it better than Dennis Lynch. Sorry, David Lynch is a famous director. Dennis Lynch is a famous rhetorician. I think that their quote when they're explaining analyzing to understand is really essential to. They say it better than I ever could, and so that's when we use quotes, right? When someone says it better than we can. So here we go. This is what they have to say about analyzing to understand. Quote, if we can describe the parts of a text and how they fit together into a whole, then we can say we understand the text and what its composer's purpose might have been in producing it. Close quote. And that is on page 42 in the Little DK Handbook. So one thing I will note about the Little DK Handbook is that Wysocki and Lynch say composer instead of author. So in the lecture, unless I've done a direct quote, I've tried to change the word because I've been using author, and not Arthur, that's the king we're studying. I've been using author in my verbiage to you, so I don't want you to get confused. They're the same thing, right? An author of a textbook has the same job as an author of a film. They just use composer as that word in terms of someone that is creating something. So don't get confused about that. So, analyzing to understand. There's two steps that Wysocki and Lynch recommend to understand to create an analysis for understanding. The first step they suggest on page 43 is to identify the persuasive strategies chosen by the text authors. And they define strategy as anything you can identify in a text that is a choice made by the text composer. So, here are some choices that an author can make when they're creating a film or creating a short story or creating a prose narrative like like Mallory does in Morte d'Arthur. Some of those choices include different kinds of arguments, so you can gain different kinds of arguments that are developed within the text itself. They present different kinds of evidence. They use specific kinds of organization. The organization in the film versus the prose fiction that we read is going to be different because of the genre or the medium they're using in that genre. Different choices of style, and that again is going to be influenced by the audience, what the word choice is going to be, what the length of it's going to be, etc. And finally, other features that are specific to that genre. So when we're talking about a prose narrative like Thomas Mallory's piece, features of the genre might be to have some rhyming in the prose. Whereas if we're talking about a film, features of that might be getting certain actors to play in a certain role. So an example I want to use is The Sword and the Stone. So let's talk a little bit about identifying the strategies chosen by the text authors. And I'm thinking about some of the discussions we've had about The Sword and the Stone, where you've identified some of the arguments and that evidence for the argument, for the overall purpose. For instance, several of you said the purpose is probably to teach an audience of young children some sort of moral about brains over brawn. And then you gave me evidence of, Merlin giving Arthur books to study instead of encouraging him to compete in a joust. And ultimately, Arthur becomes king because of that. So different arguments and evidence are made there. And then the organization of the piece. The way that the piece is organized in The Sword of the Stone is completely dependent upon audience. I mean, for instance, you have some dialogue-heavy sections, but then those are quickly replaced in between by action settings, because that's what's going to keep a kid's attention when they're watching a cartoon. If it was just Merlin and Arthur speaking the whole time, a kid watching a cartoon might start to tune that out, but having a nice squirrel chase in the middle of it or a funny wolf in the forest trying to chase Arthur with Arthur not being able to know it is an important part of the organization. And style, I mean, we know it's for audience because of children because it's an animated Disney film. And so those identifying those strategies to appeal to that audience is really important. And then there's special features in the piece that are specific to that. The colors of the animations, the way the characters are drawn, etc. So all of these things are playing together in the animated version of The Sword and the Stone, and they're specifically chosen by the text's author, you know, the creators of The Sword and the Stone, in order to create a specific purpose for their audience. So that first step is just being able to identify them, okay? So the second step in analyzing to understand is to consider how the strategies help us identify the audience, purpose, and context of a text, which is a little bit of what I talked about before. So why might the text composer have chosen each of these strategies? And some things that you can ask yourself is, who is the audience? You know, when you're talking about the audience of an animated Disney film, yes, the audience is children, but there's also another implied audience too, right? If kids are going to watch a movie, who's probably going to watch it with them or watch it first? Parents. So the text might consider the parents too. If it was just about a coyote being chased throughout the whole thing, that might appeal to the audience of children, but a lot of parents, when their children watch something, they want it to have some sort of educational value, which in turn becomes having the purpose of having a higher arching purpose in the film The Sword and the Stone when we say that there is a moral to the story. And it appeals to children because the moral might relate to their experiences as children, but it's also going to appeal to those parents because there's some sort of moral purpose in teaching your children brain over bronze, or right from wrong. And then finally, when you're considering how audience and purpose works, you also have to consider the context. And what I mean by context is you have to think about everything that's surrounding the text. And when we talk about the text of the film, the animated film, The Sword and the Stone, the context surrounding it is it's, you know, from the 1960s. So you have to consider what children in the 1960s would have been like, what are some of the things they might have been interested in. And you have to consider how when the children from the 1960s might approach that film versus a kid from, say, 2015. A kid today, you know, some of those hand-drawn animations don't necessarily appeal to children as much today because their animation style, the choices that the author makes with the 3D that looks more realistic, is something that's an expectation now of the audience. So the change in that does influence how the audience would relate to that text. So you have to consider the place and time too. You can't just consider the fact that, oh, it's a cartoon, it's made for kids. Kids' tastes change, right, through time. So hopefully this second step will help you to consider how the strategies of identifying audience, purpose, and context of a text can help you to understand the what is happening in a text. So there are 3 strategies that we've talked about so far when we talk about rhetorically understanding the text. And these are strategies that authors or composers use in order to create texts that will be appealing to a particular audience. And when we're analyzing to understand, identifying the rhetorical strategies is going to help us do that. Now, in English 101, you learned about ethos, pathos, and logos, and the next 3 slides will be a review over of ethos, pathos, and logos, but you might not have learned of a 4th appeal, which is called kairos or kairos, and we will be exploring that 4th appeal, and this will help you to build on your understanding of rhetorical strategies as you go forth in this course and as you go forth academically to create strong analytical texts. So let's start with the first one, ethos. So remember, ethos is appealing to an audience sense of authority. So we as an audience make assumptions about the composers of the text when we're considering ethos. You know, when we think of The Sword and the Stone, right off the bat, when I tell you it's a Disney movie, what do you think about that? Perhaps you think that because it's a Disney movie, there's going to be a certain amount of, assumptions about Disney that you're going to have going into the text. And those assumptions might be, well, if it's from Disney, it's good for kids. We know it's going to be an audience for kids because Disney creates content for children. So, right off the bat, just knowing it's in a Disney movie gives you a certain amount of expectations. If I say, without telling you a title, well, we're going to watch a Disney movie next week, you know just from that it's going to be a movie probably geared towards children, unless I specify otherwise. Why is that? Well, because Disney has established themselves has established their ethos in the United States as a particular kind of brand. So some of those assumptions that we make when we come to the text, we have to use those rhetorical strategies. So when you're talking about the ethos in your paper of Mallory, you have to understand a little bit about what he brings to the text and how his audience would view him. When you're looking at the film Excalibur, you have to consider the authority of the director and of Excalibur. And if you look on the IMDb link, you can find out who the director is if you wanted to learn a little bit more about that director. The second rhetorical strategy that we need to consider is pathos. People compose text to move others, and that is the strategy of pathos. And we've talked before about how pathos can be an emotional strategy. It can be something that makes someone laugh, something that makes someone cry or sing. And that is what good composers are doing to create that emotional strategy excuse me, I misspoke. What composers do is they use the rhetorical strategy of pathos to get their audience to be moved to further convince them of their purpose. So let's think again about The Sword and the Stone. What are some elements in The Sword of the Stone that are pathos? One element might be having the interludes of humor, where the big bad wolf that's following Arthur through the forest is falling around, trying to catch him, but just out of his grasp, because that might help to create the emotion in the audience of young kids, giving them a little laugh so that they'll pay attention to what's happening, to what Merlin is saying about the world is big and scary and there's all these things going on, because the child will see the wolf constantly following Arthur and make the connection between what Merlin is saying, hopefully, to the connection of what's happening visually with the wolf following Arthur. So, when you look rhetorically at the movie Excalibur and Mallory's piece, look at some ways in which those authors and composers use emotional appeals to convince their audience of something. So the third rhetorical strategy is logos or logos, and that appeals to reason, to the forcefulness of well thought out and well structured position. And for this definition, I kind of mixed it up a bit and took a look at a text by Elizabeth Losh and Jonathan Alexander, and it's called Understanding Rhetoric, A Graphic Guide to Writing. And in the works cited of the lecture, I've included that. This isn't a required text for the course, but I really encourage you, if you are struggling with understanding rhetoric and this skill and you want to improve yourself as a better writer, perhaps look at this text. I think you can get it for like $12 off of Amazon, because it's a graphic novel that explains better composition skills. Of course, it's not required for this class, but it's something I've been thinking about when I've been thinking about strategies for teaching you guys, my audience, how to understand and become better composers and readers of compositions. It's something I've been using because I think that it appeals to your audience. And I use their definition because I think their definition isn't quite as muddy. See, I'm doing an analysis here of as Wysocki and Lynch's definition of logos. I think that Losch and Alexander have a better definition of logos, in which they talk about appealing to reason. And because the Little DK Handbook says, well, yeah, it's about appealing to reason, but it's really about, unfolding in time. That's true too, but that's more Kairos, which we'll get to in a second. But structure is important when you're doing logic. Having a well-organized paragraph or an essay is going to increase your audience's sense of reason. If it's scattered and everything, we might not understand your evidence and your logic behind what you're writing. And so structure and well-timed structure is important to logos, but also evidence is important to logos. And I think that they kind of neglect that when they're talking about composition in the Little DK Handbook. And so that's why I wanted to give you a more thorough definition from Understanding Rhetoric, a graphic guide to writing. So we have talked about how logos is facts and statistics and quotes, and that's part of your evidence. But I want you to know that structure is important too. So let's think about the sword and the stone. They're giving facts and evidence about things like this is who King Arthur was, and this is his stepbrother, or I guess adopted brother, Sir Kay, and this is his uncle that's raising him. But they're also following a specific structure. I mean, if we start out at the beginning with him pulling the sword out of the stone and then suddenly he's in the woods with Merlin, the logic of what's happening just kind of goes out the door. So you have to have some structure. And there's a reason why we get who Arthur is before we meet Merlin, because there has to be some kind of setup and structure. So logos is important to appealing to reason with those statistics and facts, but remember, structure is important too when we talk about logos. And I know I keep saying logos and logos, you can say them either way. Okay, so here is the fourth rhetorical strategy, which may or may not be a new strategy to you. And that strategy is kairos, or kairos. And I am using the definition from Understanding Rhetoric by Elizabeth Losch and Jonathan Alexander because I feel like their definition is really good, and the Little DK Handbook doesn't quite cover this definition of kairos or kairos, and I think it's important. So you might not have ever heard this, and so just a way to sum up what kairos is, it's about timing. Timing is everything. And kairos is really important to being able to trace the legend of King Arthur because you have to understand the proportion of the time, the season in which this was created, in order to understand the context surrounding the argument. And so in your analysis, when you're talking about Mallory's more to Arthur, you have to understand the timing in which Mallory wrote this, a little bit of that background historical context. That's why I gave you the lecture on that background historical context, because you're going to need to know that to be able to talk to me about the audience and purpose. You're going to have to know a little bit about Mallory's life and the people that he intended this for in order to be able to fully understand the text. And so understanding strategies of kairos or kairos is going to help you to be able to do that. Same with the Excalibur film in 1981. Now, I know 1981 for some of you might seem like ancient because some of you weren't even thought about being born yet. But in the terms of when we talk about a legend like King Arthur, 1981 is pretty modern, because considering that, Mallory is writing this in the late Middle Ages, the first source of this text. So do consider it to be a modern audience when you are analyzing it, Excalibur. So just to sum up for you, when you're thinking about kairos, or the fourth rhetorical strategy, think about when and where the text was written. What is timely given its context? Why or why not? Okay, timing is everything. in order to understand the audience and purpose, you have to understand Kairos. So continuing on with our analyzing to understand, one thing you can do is analyze a thesis statement in a piece. And in Mallory's piece, you could analyze a thesis statement if you were to go back, his thesis, if you were going to go back and read the first chapter in the fictional piece. And in the film, if you look at the introduction, you can go, the first part of the film, when he's giving the background and the context, you can see an example of a thesis there. And when we're looking at for an example, when we're looking at the Sword and the Stone, the Disney film, the thesis is that overall purpose, and since the medium is film, it is going to be different than the traditional essay for a thesis statement. And since the medium of the since the medium of Mallory's piece is fictional, the thesis statement is going to be different than, say, a rhetorical analysis in a paper. And that's why I thought it would be nice for you to be able to read the sample papers, even though they're kind of off topic, in the Little DK Handbook, because what you're going to be creating is a thesis statement in a traditional rhetorical essay. And so being able to understand how a thesis statement is created in that context will help you understand how to create your own thesis statement. So when we're talking about analyzing a thesis statement and understanding it, you have to think about the three parts that a thesis statement has. The first part is evidence. And the evidence is the reason the claim should come to pass. And it could sometimes come up with a different piece of parts. The thesis statement that they analyze in the Little DK Handbook is, quote, food advertising is affecting the future health of young people. Therefore, Congress should have oversight of food advertising on TV. So the evidence they're giving is the food advertising is affecting the future health of young people. The claim they're making is Congress should have more oversight of food advertising on TV. And the warrant, or the idea or value that links the evidence to the claim, is Congress should have oversight of what affects the future health of young people. And that's on page 47 of the Little DK Handbook if you want to take a little bit closer look at that. So when you're creating a thesis statement about a rhetorical analysis about a fictional genre, your evidence, claim, and warrant will be similar, but they will address the needs of the genre of fiction, whereas the example in our text is nonfiction. So you just have to kind of mold those to be in that way to be able to do that. And we're going to do a sample thesis statement in a few slides with the film The Sword and the Stone, and so that might help you to consider evidence, claim, and warrant for creating a thesis statement in creating a rhetorical analysis. So keep this in mind, keep these three parts of the thesis in mind. We'll return to those later in a bit. So one thing I'm asking you to do in Unit 2 is to create a working thesis. And so a question you might be having is, what in the heck is a working thesis, and why should I have one? So a working thesis is just a thesis that might change later. It's a work in progress. So it's a thesis you come up with that is a statement about what direction you think your rhetorical analysis might go in, with the understanding that as you start to ask questions and dig deeper into the paper, that the thesis might change. And the reason that you should use one is it will help you to create a structure it'll help you to more easily create a structure for drafting a rhetorical analysis. And so that is what a working thesis is and why you should use one. In a moment, when we get in the questioning section, I'll address some more ways to use a working thesis, but if you're thinking about the assignment of creating a working thesis and you're kind of like, okay, what is that? The questioning section of the lecture will help you to do that. Also, I'd like to point out on page 49 in the Little DK Handbook, the rhetorical analysis that sample that they have for a short essay on the book Naked by David Sedaris, and it is actually an analysis of the cover. And if you are looking for an example of what an analysis looks like, even though this is analysis of a different topic than we're covering, I think this is a pretty good example. So do take a look at that on your own time. So we've talked about analyzing to understand, so now we should talk about analyzing to ask questions. So when you're thinking about analyzing to ask questions, the first question you should be thinking about is, does the text achieve the author's purpose? So questions you might ask yourself is, do the strategies used in the text fit with its purpose? Is the intended audience likely to be persuaded by the strategies used? So for example, in The Sword and the Stone, does the strategy of using the wolf to explain the purpose of there is a scary world out surrounding you all the time, which is kind of horrifying now that I think of it, is that strategy effective? Do you think a 7-year-old would even notice that consciously or subconsciously? Maybe or maybe not. Now you're starting to see, when we're starting asking questions, how you could write an entire paper about how the strategies fail in Disney's Sword of the Stone to reach their intended audience. One thing I want to say here is, remember the rhetorical situation definition we've talked about previously? You know, that triangle where how the audience, text, and context interrelate. Audience, text, and audience, text, and author interrelate in order to create the purpose. That definition will come in handy. I told you it would, because when you're analyzing to ask questions, that's what you're doing. You're considering the rhetorical situation. You're considering, and remember, the rhetorical situation is the relationship between the audience, purpose, the audience, text, and author. And so remember, the rhetorical situation is the situation between the author, audience, and text. And in order to understand the rhetorical situation's relationship between those three things, you have to understand the context and the purpose. If you're needing a little review on that rhetorical situation, go back and look at one of the first lectures in the course. So, analyzing to ask questions. What do I think about the purpose and the strategies used to achieve it? Do I support the purpose? Are the strategies they used valid? Do I think the strategies are ethical? Do I think the text composer respects the text audience? These are questions that you can ask yourself when you're starting to analyze the purposes that authors try to achieve by using those rhetorical strategies of ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos. Sometimes the strategies are effective and sometimes they're not. And when you're creating an analysis, what you're doing is evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies. And so I definitely recommend, as you're thinking about drafting your paper, thinking about some of these questions that Wysocki and Lynch raise in the Little DK Handbook. So one thing I do want to mention when we talk about analyzing to ask questions is that when I'm asking you to be critical, it doesn't mean you have to be a jerk, okay? There is a difference between critical, critique, and criticism when we're talking about academic reading and writing. You know, people usually think when someone says it's criticism or I'm being critical that they're being negative about something, but you can also be critical and be positive about something. And to be critical is just to exercise careful and informed judgment or evaluation, not taking things at face value. So when you see something like The Sword and the Stone and you think about the audience and purpose, you're looking at it critically to understand how that piece is working. A critique is different from being critical in that it considers the strengths and limitations of a piece. So you're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of a piece about that audience and purpose. So when you are writing your rhetorical analysis, the strategy of critique is probably going to come in handy for you because you will be judging the effectiveness and the strengths and weaknesses of Thomas Mallory's piece and the Excalibur piece. Criticism comes from critique, and it is a statement of evaluation or interpretation of the text. And there are different methods for critiquing and being critical or creating criticism. And the method that we're going to focus on in our Unit 2 study is the method of rhetorical analysis for being critical. Okay, so just the takeaway: you don't have to be a jerk to be critical. You can be critical with positives and negatives. One thing I really like in the DK Handbook is page 51, and that's some questions for critical reading. And before we talk about those questions, I think the first thing that you might need to consider is what is reading. So when we talk about reading a textbook, or when I ask you to read a short story or a piece of poetry, you know, you're reading something on the page. But think about it. If you think about the definition of reading, that's putting together some symbols to create a meaning, right? So when you're watching a film, you are reading it because you're putting together pieces and symbols, some audio, some visual, to develop meaning to that piece. So when we're talking about critical reading, it's not just reading something that's written down on a page or on a website link. It can also be listening to something, viewing something. It's just the underlying meaning and understanding we bring to that piece, okay? And the reason I like page 51 in the Little DK Handbook is because they have some questions that you might consider. Now, they have a lot of different questions you might consider when you're trying to critically read something, and I'm not going to go over all of those with you, but if you're kind of stuck on, okay, how do I understand this film? How do I understand Mallory's piece? One thing you might consider are some of the questions that they have about audience, purpose, context, ethos, pathos, and logos in the Little DK Handbook to help guide your thought processes. So I would definitely take a look at that page because I think that page will help you get started if you're feeling stuck and not quite understanding. Okay. Another thing to consider is that in Mallory's piece, we did not read the thing in its entirety because it's really long. It's not like 900 pages. And since you're really only writing a 3 or 4 page paper here, you're not going to be able to cover it in its entirety and the film in its entirety. So probably a good strategy for your logos or your organization is going to be to focus on, you know, some specific similarities and differences in the film and the writing. And you're probably going to start with what I would do is start with the film first and pick a section of the film that I thought was most interesting, that I think I could analyze most critically, and then compare it to Mallory's piece on that piece. So what you might have to do if we didn't cover that particular piece in the readings that we did through the links, you might have to go back and look through the archive of links and read the particular section that you want to focus on in order to do a strong analysis. And that is completely fine with me as long as you're using those two texts and no other outside sources. I don't care what the people of the internet think about these things. I'm wanting to know what you think about these things. And I'm not going to tell you you're right or wrong if you follow the instructions and are able to give me the evidence in your paper and use your own rhetorical strategies in creating your paper. Okay, so don't worry so much about your analysis being wrong as long as your composition has great strength. Okay. Another thing you can do when you're analyzing to ask questions is to consider some questions for critical writing. So we talked about reading strategies, which are going to be important for you understanding the text that you're doing, but we should also talk about some questions to consider when you're writing critically. So when you're writing critically, you should think about the texts of others when you're thinking about writing critically. You know, who might care about the arguments of the text you're considering? How can you think most broadly about the purposes, contexts, and audiences that shape the text you're analyzing? You know, if I'm asking you to write about the sword and the stone, which I'm not, I'm asking you to write about Morte d'Arthur and Excalibur, but using that, since we've been using that as an example, if I'm asking you to write about that, you can't just say it's for a general audience. You need to be specific. You need to say it's for an audience of young children and their parents, okay? Think about the purpose and context. Why would Disney make this film? What is the context surrounding it? And then, you know, as you're writing your analysis, you need to think critically about your own writing. Are you writing to consider different positions? Are you writing to the audience that I've asked you to write for? What relationships to the text shapes your writing? You know, you might not care about the Arthurian legend. It might not even be interesting to you, but and that could affect the quality of your paper if you have kind of a negative attitude about it. So think about that as you're writing. If that is the case, then it doesn't matter. Plenty of people write about things they don't care about all the time. But you have to be aware of that, so when you make choices, it doesn't come through in your writing, making it a poor piece. So when you're thinking about writing critically, think about the text that you're using in your writing, and then also think about your own writing. So, as promised, I thought that we would use analysis to develop our thesis statement. And I thought together we could create our own working thesis statement using the sword and the stone, so that you could kind of think a little bit more about, you know, have a model of, okay, how do I make a thesis for this? I have no idea. So, of course, your thesis is going to be on Mallory's Morte d'Arthur and the 1981 film Excalibur, but my thesis that for the sample is going to be on the sword and the stone. So you can't use it. So we know that the text we're using is the sword and the stone. So we talked about the audience in the lecture being children and parents of children. And we talked about the purpose. The purpose I'm going to use here, there are lots of different purposes in the piece, but the purpose I'm going to use here for simplicity's sake is the purpose of creating a moral tale of the advantages of brains over brawn, or brains over strength, if you prefer, if you don't know what brawn means, to teach children about the importance of education, okay? And who the author, I'm gonna say Arthur the whole time. Arthur and author, that gets hard. And with a southern accent. My dad's name is actually Arthur. My grandmother used to always say, Arthur. So don't let it get you confused. The author is Disney. The text is an animated film. The audience is parents and children of parents. And the purpose is creating a moral tale of the advantages of brains over strength to teach children about the purposes of education. And the context, 1963 animated film for children about the tales of King Arthur. And then, so now we've got some like background information to go from that we can start creating the thesis. So this is the purpose of the film, but the purpose of the assignment, if we look at assignment 2 directions, is to do what? Create a rhetorical analysis of how the authors. I'm doing it again. Sorry, guys. Authors. Okay. It's going to be one of those days. Create a rhetorical analysis of the author's purpose and whether they achieve the purpose with respect to the audience. Okay? So that's the purpose, right? All right, so we got our background. So now let's think about developing a thesis statement. And I told you that we would go back to those ideas of what a thesis statement was that I mentioned earlier in the lecture. And the three parts of the thesis are the evidence, the claim, and the warrant. So here, when I'm creating my working thesis, I might have to do a little bit of brainstorming. And when you do your brainstorming, there are so many different strategies for brainstorming. The Little DK Handbook even has some in there. I was taught to do the circles or the mapping or webbing, whatever you guys call it. Some people were taught to free write. That can take a few minutes, so I'm not going to do the whole process of brainstorming. But when you do your brainstorming, you can do any of those processes. I just want to kind of see your process. And if you work better handwriting and you want to handwrite it out and then take pictures of it, that's fine with me too. Okay? So the purpose of the assignment is to create a rhetorical analysis of the author's purpose, and rather they achieve the purpose with respect to their audience. Even English teachers aren't perfect. So the evidence is the reason for the claim. The claim is the statement about the condition. And the warrant is the idea or value that links the evidence to a claim. Okay? So I've got all these ideas here about it, and I know what the author's intended purpose is. And so I am going to just dive in and try to create this. And so what I'm going to argue, my argument is going to be that Disney uses the film The Sword in the Stone to create a moral tale of the advantages of brains over strength to teach about the importance of education. Okay, so Disney copy and pasting. Okay, so here's the first part of my thesis. Disney uses the 1963 film The Sword in the Stone to teach an audience of children and their parents the advantages of brain over strength, to teach children about the importance of education. So we'll have to revise this a little bit. It's a little wonky. The advantages of brain, how about if we change this, the moral purpose of the advantage of brains over strength, and then maybe we'll make a new sentence here. Along the way, Disney, I don't know the adjective to use, so I'm just going to put adjective because I know I'm going to need an adjective here. Because I'm thinking slyly, but that sounds negative, so I don't necessarily want to be negative. Along the way, children viewing the film will learn about the importance of education. Disney utilizes rhetorical strategies to achieve this particular purpose. So slyly is like the first thing that comes to my mind here when I'm talking about this. Disney slyly, smartly. Along the way, Disney smartly convinces children viewing the film about the importance of education. Disney uses, okay, here we go. So, see, I had to go through a lot of processes to get this down. So, Disney uses the 1963 film The Sword and the Stone to teach an audience of children and their parents the moral purpose of the advantage of brains over strength. Along the way, Disney smartly convinces children viewing the film about the importance of education. Disney utilizes rhetorical strategies to achieve this particular purpose. So, again, there were all sorts of different purposes that we've mentioned in our discussions about The Sword and the Stone that you guys came up with. I'm just honing in on one because I'm only going to be able to talk for 3 pages about one. You don't have to have 3 different categories to talk about it for 3 pages. I'm going to have plenty enough to talk about with this because I'm going to be talking about rhetorical strategies, and that means I'm going to have to look in close. So this is my working thesis. As I start to brainstorm and as I start to draft later, this might change a little bit. But right now, it looks pretty darn good. So I would say that this is ready to turn in as a working thesis. So underneath that, I would probably do some brainstorming, and this would be a way to kind of help me think what direction I might take the paper in. Now, you can brainstorm by just free writing, you can brainstorm with your mapping, etc. I'm just going to make a list about the things that I might talk about. So I might say discuss ethos, and then I might talk about Disney as an authority figure, the legend of Arthur as an authority. It's been around for a really long time. Merlin as a figure. He's seen as a wise old man through the course of the legends that we've been learning about. I might talk about pathos, some of the humor that Disney uses to get their purpose across. And I might just jot down some examples. The silly wolf in the woods. The oaf, Sir Kay. I might say I'll discuss logos. I'll talk about the organization and how that proves the purpose that I'm going to talk about. I might talk about some of the evidence and facts that Merlin gives in the piece. I might talk about Kairos and talk about the audience of children in 1963. I might talk about the style of the piece. So you can see all just by thinking about it for a second, I got a little bit of a brainstorm here about I'm probably talking about the ethos and here are some examples of that. I'll probably talk about the pathos and here are some examples of that. And you can already start to see a paper starting to kind of form here. And I'll save this file and upload the file if you want to look at this file later to the document so you can see an example of the working thesis. Yours, of course, is going to be on Thomas Mallory's piece in The Sword and the Stone, so it's going to be a little bit more compare-y, contrasty. Those are technical terms. You'll be using both of those things in your working thesis. I thought, since we all know The Sword and the Stone, that this would be an easy way for you to see more about the working thesis. So I do hope that helped. That is how to evaluate the thesis statement. So looking ahead, you're going to be creating your working thesis and your brainstorming, and then next time we'll be taking that thesis and using it to organize and to reason, and that'll help us with the drafting and connecting portions that'll be coming up for the major assignment too. So the tips for a working thesis, I just showed you how to construct a working thesis, but just remember, it can change. If you change your mind later, that's okay. As you start to unpack things, it might change. That's fine. Brainstorming, if you need some more help on how to brainstorm, if that's something that you haven't learned in your composition process, I really hope that is not the case. then you can look in the Little DK Handbook on brainstorming and how to do that. And you can also look to the Bedford Book of Genres on brainstorming. They've got some good tips for how to brainstorm and create those sorts of things. So finally, what I want to leave you with is the so what. So why are we learning to analyze? Well, we're learning to analyze to help us become better critical readers and better critical writers, because that's the reason why you take Comp 102 in college. Why are we tracing the King Arthur myth? I picked the King Arthur myth because it is something that changes through time, and it goes with our theme of storytelling that we kind of did in the first unit, where we talked about telling our own stories. Now we're looking about how a group of people have told a story through generations and how that generation has changed and how we can rhetorically analyze it. This will help you in your academic career because you'll be learning strategies for becoming a better writer, reader, and critical thinker. And no matter the discipline you go into, you might not go in the discipline of the humanities, so you might not ever have to trace an author or Arthur's work. But in your discipline, you will have to trace and you will have to trace trends. You will have to look at critical thinking and analysis. Even if you're going into the business world, you're going to need to know how to read critically to learn how to do accounting. You're going to need to know how to read critically to understand economic changes, okay? And this will help you in your everyday life, because once you become a good critical writer and a good critical thinker and a good critical reader, you will be a better part of society. Trust me. I don't want to go to a hospital with a nurse that doesn't know how to think through a problem. Their life is in my hands. I want my nurse to be able to think critically and to make decisions. And that's the kind of things, even though if you might not be aware of it right now, these exercises help you develop on an advanced level. And finally, my works cited for the lecture is here in MLA format if you wanted to see the sources that I used to create this. I think one misconception that students have about teachers is that we know everything, and we do know our disciplines. Trust me, I'm a master in my discipline, and I have lots of experience to be able to teach you and tell you about this. But just like you have to do when you're learning a subject, you have to do your due diligence and find your sources. I have to do the same thing too. And I wanted to make sure that I'm modeling that for you, because research doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen in a paper that a teacher asks you to write. Research, it happens in your everyday life. So I want to make sure I'm including that works cited for you. And if you just wanted to check out Understanding Rhetoric, there's the information if you wanted to find it out. It's really cool. I'd actually like to use it for the class, but right now we're using the Bedford, and I really like the Bedford. So that is the works cited for the lecture. So I hope that this has helped you understand more about the legend of King Arthur, in particular how to rhetorically analyze tracing the legend from Thomas Malory to the 1981 film Excalibur.